Hello, this is your host, Matt Brunquell, for today's webinar on converting Lotus Notes applications to .NET. And we're going to go ahead and get started now. And conversion projects can be a low-risk, cost-effective way to retain your investment in Lotus Notes applications. Before we get started, though, I want to review a few housekeeping items. For those of you new to Composer Technologies, we are part of Dagis, a U.S.-based company that does application modernizations worldwide. We encourage questions on the webinar, and the way you do that is to use the Q&A button on your WebEx toolbar. It's the button with the question mark, and there's also a chat button, but it just makes it easier for Brian and I to look in one panel, the Q&A panel, for all of the questions to make sure we address all of them. Now, I mentioned Brian, and that's Brian Halstead, who will be providing the demonstration portion today. Brian is, I was going to say one of our senior migration specialists, but he's the most senior one. He actually does the development on the Composer Notes product as well. So it's a great opportunity that we have him available to demo this today. So with that, we'll go ahead and review the agenda. And what we're going to do is just give you a about 5-minute introduction to or overview of Composer Notes to give you some context going into the demo. And then we'll go ahead and do a demonstration. Now, the Composer Notes solution has been out for over 8 years, and conversions can be delivered as a service, or the tool can be licensed with training and support. And what you see here in this diagram is it actually takes the entire Notes application, or NSF, including the document data and the database, and it converts it into a Microsoft .NET stack. Now, with Composer Notes, you can migrate complex Lotus Notes applications to ASP.NET, and much of the conversion is automated, but there are some items that are not converted automatically just due to environmental differences between Lotus Notes and a 3-tier .NET architecture. And as part of the tool, there's an analyzer utility which will flag these differences so the time and effort to complete the migration can be estimated. The generated application is a .NET application and can be maintained and extended in Visual Studio. All of the source code is provided, so there's no runtime licensing dependencies. Now, the solution does not convert Notes apps to SharePoint, which we get asked about sometimes. Some Notes apps are well suited to SharePoint, like the Nifty 50 template-based applications and simple forms which just capture data. However, many customers have found that the more complex Notes apps just aren't a good fit or not even feasible in SharePoint. And these include Notes applications that have large data volumes, a lot of functionality coded in Formula or Lotus Script, or they have agents and hides when functionality. Composer Notes also does not convert web-based or Notes apps, or sometimes they're called domino apps, but often the customer still has a Notes client version that can be migrated, or they have in an app, you know, they have all the design elements for the client version of the app, and then they will have JavaScript sections for the web-based. But as long as you have those client-based version of the app, that's what Notes is really geared to for converting, Composer Notes. And any JavaScript in the app also has to be rewritten. So we just went through the capabilities of the solution at a high level, but let's take a moment just to outline the key benefits of Composer Notes and things to kind of keep in mind when you're looking at the demo coming up. So the solution converts the user interface, the business logic, the Notes database, document data, and ACL security. And this includes providing much of the underlying capabilities that the Lotus Notes framework provided. And customers have given us feedback that this saves them anywhere from 3x to 5x reduction in time over their rewrite estimates because they don't have to recreate all of that Lotus Notes framework, if you will, that was available when those apps were created on the Notes side. In addition to producing clean .NET code, The file structure of the components and objects are organized much as they were in Lotus Notes as well. And this provides a reference point that both the original Notes developers and the .NET developers can follow. And in particular for Lotus Notes developers, it also eases the learning curve into .NET. So if some of you, if some of the attendees today are Notes developers, I think you'll be very surprised by what you see in the converted .NET code. Customers also emphasize the benefit of maintaining the look, feel, and navigation for the initial conversion in order to minimize the impact on the end users and avoid retraining on the app. And avoiding retraining on the app can be a significant cost savings, especially if you have a large user base that are using these apps to be migrated. And customers have also found it's much more straightforward to test a conversion versus a rewrite to make sure all the functionality and behavior is present, as well as the data. So user testing is much less difficult and lower risk if you can compare the converted .NET app and data results directly with the original Notes application. So with that background, let's go ahead and go into the demonstration. And here's what you'll see in the demo. And there's kind of three takeaways or three things to keep in mind when you're watching the demo. So we're going to convert a Lotus Notes app to an ASP.NET app, and we'll show you the various elements in the Notes app before we convert it, just so you have a feel for what we're converting. And it's not as large as some customer applications, but it does have the design elements and components and business logic that you see in most complex apps, just not the same amount, if you will. If we ran this through our analyzer utility, which I had mentioned earlier in the presentation, it would come up as a low intermediate complexity because of the smaller size. This is a full conversion of the user interface, business logic, Notes database, the document data or attachments, and the ACL security. And then the third thing is, after converting the app, we're going to deploy it, the converted .NET app, so you can see the same functionality and navigation of the Notes client app now in a browser as a .NET application. And you'll be able to see how that impact to the end users is minimized when we show you the converted app. And then we'll also, at that point, we'll open up the project in Visual Studio so you can look at the converted code, and you can kind of see how that project hierarchy and naming of the components is maintained. And with that, what I'm going to do now is make Brian a presenter.
Okay, so as I was saying, this is a kind of standard run-of-the-mill Notes application that you typically see in the Notes world. We have an outline on the left that navigates the various views. Here we have a view being displayed that has all the document records being displayed. Some of these views, I think we have a categorized view here. It shows the documents in a categorized order. If I open up one of the documents, here's the main form for this application that the document data is being displayed with. Has various fields, radio buttons, drop-down lists, rich text controlled, and also is using a tab table. So just to kind of show you what the original design looks like here from Lotus Notes. Okay, and has action buttons and some history tracking at the bottom there. So I'm not going to go too much else into this application, but you can see it's just, a pretty basic, more or less, application. So if I want to convert this application, my first step is to create a database in the receiving DBMS server. So in this case, it'll be SQL Server. I'm just going to create a new database and call it demo. I'm just going to use the standard options from SQL Server when creating a new database. So I'll have DBO access to the database. Okay, so the database is created. So then from Visual Studio, once Composer has been installed, you'll have it as a new website template. So you'll have Composer website displayed here in your template list. So I'm just going to create a new project. I'm going to call it demo using the Composer website template and say OK. So the next thing that comes up is the import wizard. This wizard just allows you to select the various options to control how the NSF is converted, and some of those options may include how it's going to process document data during the conversion, components from templates that an NSF may be derived from, whether or not to normalize multi-valued fields within the database that I just created, and then some other options too, to add buttons or to use master pages. So I already have the training database selected here. I selected this prior, so otherwise you just browse for it and select the correct NSF file. So with that being done there, I'm just going to go ahead and hit next. I've got my database server selected here, the database demo already indicated, and we're also going to use the full text indexing options here. And I'm just going to use a trusted connection. So I'll test that connection succeeded, and hit finish. So during this process, it will extract DXL from the NSF and then start analyzing it. During that analysis process, it will discover all the elements and then start building up a list of classes that will represent the various elements within the application. And then you see the conversion start to happen over here in the Solution Explorer. So it should be done about in just a couple of seconds here. It's importing the document. And there it is. So it just finished. This message here is just indicating that certain constructs that existed within Lotus script and possibly formula language may not have converted directly. So in those cases, to-do comments are inserted into the code, where then you could go through easily with Visual Studio and review each to-do comment to see whether or not the code is accurate and if it got converted correctly, or, after you get the application to compile, run it and then debug those sections where the to-do comments are to make sure it's actually functioning as it should or as it did when it was in Notes. So here's the basic structure of the application. We break up all the main elements into separate folders within the app code folder for a Visual Studio website project. So we have here shared actions, agents, forms, script libraries. Services is what we add. This is just exposing views as web service calls, if that is required later on, if you want to expose the application as a web service. We have subform elements and then view elements. One main difference between Lotus Notes, like Domino Designer and Visual Studio, is all of the business logic or code that existed within the, say, form elements will now exist within two main separate classes in a C# file. The UI portion of the same elements are now represented by either ASPX pages or ASPX user controls. Subforms get converted as ASPX user controls because those can be shared across multiple forms, as well as view grids. They will have an actual ASPX page and then a grid control because views can be embedded into forms. So that allows those to be shared across multiple forms. So without going too much further into that right now, I'll just go ahead and try to build this website. It should have one compilation issue. This compilation issue is just an ambiguous reference because this class contains a field with the same name as an enum that exists within our runtime. So I resolved that by including the full namespace, and I'll build the whole website again. And then I will run the application here just to show you how it looks directly after conversion and fixing compilation issues. So I'm just going to start this up in Visual Studio. And it's going to run it locally here on my computer. Okay. So there are some slight differences. You obviously will need to do some slight UI cleanup after the conversion. So there were some icons that were available in the outline. Those can easily be replaced within the tree controls that we use. You just have to relink those to the actual icons because those don't come over in the DXL. Otherwise, most of the views will be formatted correctly. You may have to adjust some row height possibly later on, but they come over good. Here we have a categorized view. So, this was showing as it was showing in Notes. We also support the view icons in the views. So, any icons that were being displayed through like an icon column, those will come over correctly. So I'm going to go ahead and open a document just to show you what the converted form actually looks like. So here's the form that was converted, the main form for the application. As you see, we have various controls here, the drop-down list, radio button list. We have a rich text field here with an attachment, the buttons. We also have our tab tables. This is our tab set control. So the data came over, and the design came over fine. We have that history that came over from the data. The function of the form actually works similar to how it does in Notes. So as you can see, like right now, this form's in read mode. If I double-click, I can push it into edit mode. So now we're in edit mode. And you see our rich text control. Hide whens came over fine. So if I click this radio button, you see that the hide when is executing. That's hiding or showing this reason field. I think there's some other hide when somewhere, I forget where. But anyway, this is the basic, what came over from the NSF design. So this application is not fully functional yet. Part of the process of doing the conversion, there is a manual portion, which means I would have to go through to-do items. Most likely, if I try to start executing buttons and stuff on this form, it'll probably end up throwing errors because there may be something that's not quite that got converted correctly. So in Visual Studio, you usually will find your to-do items in your task list, and you'll see that each to-do item that was converted is displayed here in this task list. So an example of a to-do item is Dialog Box Calls. Dialog Box Calls are rather complex, and in our environment, you have to have a callback defined because the server has to communicate with the client and wait for the user's response and then execute code after the response. So those are a typical to-do. And there's various other ones too where Composer may have generated or not be able to convert Lotus script, like evaluate statements. Those aren't really supported because that would require compiling and generating an assembly on the fly for every single evaluate. So those usually have to be handled manually. So those are just some simple examples. Just to show you what the code actually looks like. So looking at the main form here, we have two main classes. One is the value class, what we call the value class. It's based off of our base document class. This defines that document object while it's being processed on the server. So it represents the document object in memory. So this contains all the field items and then the attributes that define those items. Is it a names control? What's its compute type? Compute when composed, compute always, or compute for display. Some of those various options that you would set in the field properties from the Notes client. So all those come over for the field attributes. We also have the manager class, which is the next main class. And this is where all of the code logic will end up. So if you had any computed fields, any of that logic, the formula language, that will end up in here. All the hide whens will end up in this class. Any buttons that are defined for that form will end up in here as well as any other form events. So I believe there's a query save on here. So here's the query save that came over from the client. You'll notice that our implementation of the Notes classes is very similar to what they look like in Lotus script. There are some slight syntactical differences because Lotus script is different from C#. But if a Notes developer who's familiar with Lotus script were to be shown the C# code, they could probably, figure it out relatively easily without too much difficulty because it does work very similar. as far as the database goes, each form that existed within the application or that was discovered through the document data will end up being assigned a form table. So, for example, that main form, the FRM NJE, it got its own form table. Any documents that are assigned to that form will then, during import, be inserted into this table. So if I just look at the records real quick, every column or field that existed within the document ends up being a column, plus some system columns that we add that are typical to Notes documents. So all the data comes over and is inserted into here. And sizes are calculated for these tables if the NSF has data. If it doesn't, then the sizes for columns will just be set to a default size, which I believe will be around 128 characters. Attachments are set into another table and are linked back to the original documents through a rich text field link based on the original Notes IDs. The Notes IDs are maintained as they were in Notes, and then future documents that are created in the applications will be assigned a similar unique Notes ID based off the .NET GUID. And as well as we have some other system tables that keep track if there's folders, child documents, timestamps, and then the composer values table is for maintaining multi-valued normalized values. So that roughly, also too, and from the Notes client, you have various options available in the client from, the menus that are in the client. We can't add menus to the browser because the browser won't allow that. So what we've done is instead added to a context menu. So any forms that were set to be available through the create menu in the client. So, we have this create menu here and we have the action menu here. We just put those in the context menu. So now you have the create menu here, which will compose a new journal entry. And then the actions, here's those agents. So you have various agents available that were available through the actions menu in the client. We also provide some of the other options that may be available from the client menu, like expanding or collapsing sections, looking at security information, the about or using this application. There's also some other ones from the view menu that are available. So from here, we also have, copy as table. And then there's also, we have a built-in export too as well. So it seems like most customers usually have some form of export functionality from views to be able to export to Excel or to a CSV file. And then we also allow to import data from a CSV or Excel file. That about covers the general demo. Matt, can you think of anything else, or are we ready to do questions?
I think we're ready to go to the Q&A, but as you can see from what Brian demoed, you have a very similar user experience that gets converted over into a web browser, so that the users are not going to have to be retrained. In fact, in all of the projects we've been involved in, we always ask the customer, hey, did you have to retrain the end users on the app? And they always point out that they haven't, which is a significant piece. But the other flip side to that is that not just is the impact to the end users minimized, but also on the IT side, the testing gets much more streamlined because now they can just do a side-by-side comparison in their testing and say, all right, is it producing, the same functionality, same look and feel, but also just as importantly, is it getting the same data results? And when you can compare side by side like that, it really streamlines that whole testing process, as opposed to if you were doing a rewrite where you would have to, write new test scripts, and which also involves IT and the end user organizations making time to get together to validate those test scripts and then going through those. It becomes a much more involved process and introduces a lot more variable into your project. All right, so what we'll do now is we're going to open this up for questions. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning, the way you do that is use the Q&A button, which is up in your upper right-hand corner. It's a little blue box with the question mark that says Q&A. And we'll give you a minute here for those questions to come in. And we'll start with Alberto's since he was the first one to put one in. And then we'll start going through them. And Brian, what I'll do is I'll read the question, and then depending on how technical it is, you know, either I'll answer it or you will, and then if one of us needs to add on to that, that's what we'll do.
Okay, sounds good. So do we want to start with Alberto just to get his
Yeah,
question?
just like I said, we waited 1 minute to let some of the questions come in. We'll start it in just a minute so some people can compose their questions.
Okay.
All right, so first question. I have a notes application that also has a web section. This means this could not be converted, or that's the question. If it has a web section, can the Notes app be converted? I'll let you answer that one, Brian.
Okay, Alberto. I'm not sure exactly what you mean by a web section. If you're talking about the section of a form that's like passed through HTML, possibly. What happens with forms or elements that are designed to be used with a browser from the Domino is that the HTML does not get converted to pass through HTML, nor does the JavaScript, and any Java agents as well. So if you have a form that primarily consists of just field elements that exist within the form, and then all the rest of the design is primarily HTML, then what will most likely convert over is just the fields. The form elements will still come over and still be defined, as well as the value class and any logic that exists in there, as long as it's Lotus script or formula language. However, any of the other HTML, JavaScript, or Java will not be converted, and that will have to be done by hand. So in a sense, the forms will have to be redesigned or relaid out in HTML and ASP markup after the conversion if you're trying to convert a web-enabled NSF.
Great. Next question. How is user security handled? And the examples they use is like DBACL, groups, read-write.
Okay, so by default, or actually what's most commonly supported for security providers from the ASP.NET website would be the directory, Active Directory, which is our directory provider that we provide as part of the Composer runtime. So, for example, I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen again.
Yes, I left the presenter role with you just in case. So,
so if I were to look at this application here, I'm just going to go ahead and stop it. The original access control list comes over as an acl.xml file. And if we just look at that real quick here in Notes, what the ACL actually looks like. So here's the original access control. I mean, this ACL is rather simple because, you know, for demonstration purposes, you may have a more complex one, but most often you will have to change the ACL anyway once you move to .NET. So I seriously doubt your Active Directory would be exactly in alignment with the Domino directory or the Notes address book. So, but this is just how it looks. We had, you know, various roles here defined. We have a couple groups in here, and then the default group set to manager access. So admins have manager access. I think all these, this has editor access. So back here in the acl.xml file, here's all the various roles, the custom roles that were defined for the application, and then also the members of those roles. So we have the default group, a member of everything, and then the admins group, developers. And then here's the access role. So who's under the manager access role was default and admins group. and then under the editor access level was developers. And the way this works is if within Active Directory, if I have an admins group defined based off of the location in the directory that's been configured in the web.config, for the root key or the key that I want to start at in the directory using the LDAP connection. If there's an admins group and I'm a member of that group, then this pretty much just maps me into the application. So it will then, when my security context is created by the runtime based on either Windows authentication, which will just pass through your credentials, or you can use forms authentication where you have a login page where you put give a username and password. The security provider will then query or I should say our provider will query the security provider, which in this case would be Active Directory, locate my username and build my security context. If I'm a member of the admins group, then I'll be given manager access and then also be included as part of the app admin role for the application. As far as readers and authors document level security, we support that fully. We do maintain canonical names in the converted applications. So if any readers fields exist within the applications, then our runtime will process those to make sure that the current user is a member of one of those readers fields. If they're not, then they will not be able to see those document records and views or not have any access to them. And the same thing with author fields. For anyone who has author level access to the application, then they are affected by author fields and either will be given edit or read access to documents based on the values that exist within those fields, whether they're groups, usernames, or application role names. The canonical names may have to be changed, though, possibly from the original application to the new environment, because canonical names are built by a runtime based off the location of the user object within Active Directory. So we will build those based off of the location Active Directory. So this will also, obviously, as I said, your Active Directory may not be similar to your Domino directory. So we also have a utility that will help translate those names after the final import of data, where what it'll do is do a comparison between an XML file provided from the Domino directory and then link to your Active Directory and then scan data within all the document data and then update canonical names correctly that are found that can be resolved. That's like a whole other process that can be explained at a later time, most likely.
Great. Well, so as you can see, the security piece is definitely covered, and we have experience with that. And just to sum up that, there's a lot of the security that gets automatically converted if you're using Active Directory as your provider. There is some things that have to be done as part of the project after the automated conversion, but we have utilities to assist with that. So next question, do you guys have a list of things which cannot be handled as part of the conversion process? The short answer to that is yes. As I had mentioned in the presentation piece, we have an analyzer that you can run the NSFs through, or that we run the NSFs through, that will identify things that will not be either automatically migrated or some decisions have to be made on, to say, yeah, do you want to proceed this way? A lot of those get flagged as to-dos, as Brian had touched on. But just to give you some examples of things that don't get migrated automatically when you push the conversion button, if you will, on Composer Notes, frame sets, navigators, if there's specific functionality from Notes 8 that have been used, then some of that doesn't get automated. NSF mail-in functionality, and like Notes address book lookups. Those are just a few examples of some things that don't get migrated automatically. And then some of that, though, is still addressed as part of the conversion project, though. Brian, go ahead. You wanted to add to that?
I was going to say, well, when you say the Notes address book lookups, we don't do lookups to Domino or to the actual Domino directory or Notes address book. Instead, that will be, we support like the names fields and lookups to your security provider, which will take the place of that Notes address book lookup. So that's the slight difference. If you're actually doing direct queries through code to the Notes address book, that will not be converted directly. Those will have to be rewritten slightly to query Active Directory or whichever security provider you happen to be using. So those parts of the code will have to be manually adjusted because you can't access the Notes address book directly through code any longer.
Right, and that's a great example of what I was just saying too. Is as you can see, there are some things that have to be handled as part of the project that the tool doesn't do automatically. But we definitely have experience with that and best practices. So whether you decide to have the migration done as a service, or if you decide to license the tool, there's training available so that we can train you on how to handle those things. Next question: how does your tool deal with date in different time zones and not consistent pattern? I don't know if you can follow that question or not, Brian, but it's asking how we deal with dates in different time zones.
We do. We just skipped over Alberto. Alberto said he had another question about Java agents. Just to touch on that real quick.
Sorry.
Just to touch on that real quick, Alberto. As I said, Java is not converted, so any Java agents that had existed in the applications, they will not be converted. Those will have to be converted by hand, manually. Once the application has been converted, you'd have to just take your Java code and then translate it over to C#, and then anything that's specific that's out that if you're not accessing just Notes objects in the Java code, if you're doing some like web service stuff, some SOAP requests or whatever, then that will have to be translated over to the .NET version of how those things are done. Okay, so as far as dealing with different time zones, Notes does track time zones within its date time fields. So we take that into consideration when importing data. All data, unless you choose not to, will be imported into GMT or Greenwich Mean Time or Universal Time into the database. Then once the data is retrieved, the date time zones will be translated back out based on the time zone that exists for the server that the application is running on. So that's how the time zones are managed. They can be managed as well based on browser locale as well.
Okay. We'll make sure I don't skip any questions here. How are multi-value fields in Notes treated while converting to the new database? But Brian, before you go into this, I just want to point out, as part of the conversion, this converts the data into, you have two options, either a SQL Server database or Oracle as your database. I just wanted to, I don't think we really touched on that during the presentation and demo. But Brian, go ahead and I'll respond to the multi-value field portion.
Yeah, so multi-value fields are supported. If you choose the option to not normalize them, then whatever the field name was defined in the original form will be a column in the form table, and then the values will be split or delimited with semicolons in the table. And then when the runtime queries the table and retrieves the data, it will resplit those back up and display them accordingly into the fields as they were displayed in Notes. So the fields are supported, and the separators that were defined for those fields are supported. The controls will usually be defined as multi-line text box controls, or at least that's how they'll look on the client side, so that a user can hit enter multiple values in the field, and all of that is supported.
Great. Next question, how do you create response hierarchy similar to discussion template?
So we do support response documents and also response to response documents. I don't think the application that I have here has an example of any response hierarchies, but our views do support it, and it will be displayed similar to how it was in Notes. So if a document, if a view has been set to show response hierarchy, then if there is a response column that exists in that view, it will be converted, and then it will be shown similar to how it was in Notes, so that if a document has a response, it'll have a twisty next to it, and you can expand it, and then it will list out the responses according to that response column and how the data is computed through that response column. And then if any of those responses have responses, again, they'll have a twisty next to them, and you can expand those out to see the additional responses and so on.
Great. Next question, and actually this looks like it's the last one on here right now, so if anybody has any further questions, go ahead and post them. But this question is, how does the conversion process handle the integration between Lotus Notes apps and third-party apps?
So if you're using, well, first of all, if you're using a third-party product for Domino or Lotus Notes, if that code is part of an NSF, there may be possible copyright situations involved, depending on the person, the company or whoever owns that code. But if you're just declaring or linking to third-party DLLs or assemblies, where you're using functionality through like declare statements in Lotus script, or possibly, I don't know, even importing through Java, then for the Lotus script stuff, those will come over as DLL imports methods, as external methods defined in whichever element that they were defined. So if it was in a form class, it'll be defined within the manager class, and it'll use the C# DLL import attribute, and they'll be defined as external methods. Now, each one of those will be decorated with a to-do comment as well, because for the application to build correctly and for it to run correctly when it's using an external assembly like that, obviously those assemblies have to be available and they have to be exposable to C#. So as long as they're available to C# and they've been defined correctly by the converter, then they should run fine. You also have to take into consideration that the context may be different. Normally, those things will probably be running from a user's client computer, from the Notes client. In this case, the applications will be running on a server. So you have to take that in consideration if those assemblies exist on the server, and if you want to even access such assemblies from a server context. Obviously, those assemblies can't be loaded on the user's computer from the browser due to browser security. Most often what people are using as far as third party, what we see is Microsoft Office. We support the use of the Microsoft automation code, except obviously you don't want to install Microsoft Office on a server and then be trying to launch instances of Word or Excel and opening and closing and displaying files and what have you on the server, because that's not going to do the user much good if it's all happening on the server. So we use a product called Sync Fusion, and it allows for the creation and modification of like Word and Excel files on the server without having to have Microsoft Office installed on the server. And then typically in those scenarios where you may have that code in an NSF where it would just launch the file on the user's computer, in those cases you might have to readjust the code slightly so that after you create a Word file on the server, you initiate a download to the user, and that way the browser will get the download and then they can just launch the file from the browser itself.
All right, great. Well, I don't see any other questions, so what we'll do is start wrapping this up. But if you do have one, go ahead and post it. We'll see it here. So Brian and I want to thank you for participating and attending the webinar today. So, what you saw, we gave you kind of a brief overview of the capabilities and benefits of Composer Notes, and then went through a demo. And, the takeaways from that should be, you can see how you can do a full conversion of an NSF for notes applications, from the user interface all the way through the business logic, the database, document data, and the security. And this is a much, much less effort and lower risk process than doing a rewrite. The other takeaway is, you can see that if it's important to maintain a similar user experience to minimize the retraining of your end users and the impact to them, as well as streamline the testing, this is what you should have taken away from seeing in this solution. We are going to, we recorded this WebEx, and so that will be available on our website here in the next day or so, so that you can view the recording. And we will have a representative follow up with you in case you have any further questions, or if you would, like to talk further about how Composer Notes might be able to help you with some of the business needs you might have in looking to modernize your notes and kind of leverage that investment you have in your notes apps and getting them over into your .NET stack. All right, well, thank you.
Matt,
go ahead, Brian.
We have a couple of questions.
Oh, is there some more questions?
Yeah.
Ah, perfect.
So
I'm glad you looked.
Yeah.
So the next one, regarding Lotus Notes apps, suppose if application A refers to some views and contents from application B.
Okay, so we do support lookups between applications. Obviously, you would have to convert both applications, application A and application B, and then publish them. Once they're published, then they'll need to be published into a same root folder. And what happens is, based on the application's original NSF name or even the replica ID, application A will cause the runtime to search for application B, load its assembly, and then find the view, and then load the data from the view and return the results back through either a DB lookup or DB column, or if you're accessing it by a Lotus script through Notes view, all of that's supported.
All right. Next question. What is the maximum number of documents your tool can handle?
As far as what we've experienced in the past, it'll handle hundreds of thousands of documents. Typically, Lotus Notes, you don't want to get into like the millions of documents range, because even in Notes, that will really bog down a Notes database and the Domino server and indexing processes and all that stuff. But we do have clients that have had, I believe, close to 300,000 documents in a database. So, but obviously, if you're going to have more than that, then you're going to probably experience some slowdowns if you're trying to load a view that may display millions of documents. That's just not feasible. And you may need to adjust the overall design of an application or break up the data somehow if you have a really bogged down Notes database.
Great. Next one. Oh, go ahead, Brian. What you're going to add?
I was just going to answer that question. The next one that popped up.
Well, let me read it out loud because not everyone can see that. So does the tool have any restrictions on the file size of the attachments?
So yes, the restriction is based off of what can be processed through typical .NET streaming, as well as there's some limitations to what happens during the conversion through the DXL conversion process, but the restriction size is 2 gigabytes. So you can have an attachment up to 2 gigabytes. After that, it's too large.
All right, any other questions? Great. Well, again, we thank you for participating. If you have any other questions, please follow up with us or we'll have a representative follow up with you. When you exit out of the webinar, a little survey will come up with like 3 questions. Please take a minute and respond to those. Let us know, if this is what you expected, were there things that you saw that you liked, or were there things that you didn't see that you wanted to see? And if there's specific topics you'd like to see covered in the future, let us know that. We drive some of this content off of the feedback from those surveys. As I mentioned before, we'll have a recording of this available if you want to review it. We also have a lot of other recordings on our YouTube channel and website, if you want to dig deeper. And let us know if you'd like to have something specific to your needs and company. We'd be happy to take a look and sit down and talk with you and see if we can help you out. All right, thanks, and have a great day.